the bank manager shouted, as though she had just uncovered a dangerous criminal security get-her out of here immediately. A sharp, dry crack split the morning air inside Heritage Bank's downtown Houston branch, and in that instant, every gaze locked onto the black woman standing in the center of the wide marble lobby, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her face calm in a way that felt almost unsettling. That was Danielle Brooks. No one knew that in just a few minutes, her name would shake this entire bank to its core. But right now, through the lens of branch manager Bethany Clark's prejudice, Danielle was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. Strangely, the spark for this storm was nothing but a withdrawal slip requesting $70,500 placed ever so lightly on the glass counter. Yet to Bethany, it felt like an insolent challenge from someone she was convinced could never own that kind of money. The lobby fell silent as the two security guards, Mark Hudson and Eli Turner, stepped forward. Their heavy footsteps echoed like a drumbeat of impending punishment. Silence. Tension. A flicker of unease passed through the eyes of every witness. Some were curious, some annoyed. Some pressed their lips together in sympathy, too afraid to speak up. But Danielle, the eye of this storm, remained still as stone, as if she had long grown accustomed to the cold winds of life, as if she had been expecting this very moment. Mark placed a heavy hand on her arm, a stiff, icy grip, carrying the same doubt he had directed at hundreds of customers deemed untrustworthy. But Danielle did not flinch, did not resist, did not even glance at his hand. She stared straight ahead into the empty space, as if looking through everything, looking toward the truth she knew she carried. Behind her, Bethany approached the counter, her black high heels striking the marble floor in a relentless rhythm, each step driving the invisible blade deeper into the wound forming in Danielle's chest. "What are you doing here?" "Withdrawing $70,500. Someone like you." Bethany's voice sliced through the air, dripping with judgment and disdain. Those words, "someone like you," fell like knives on the pride of countless people, like Danielle, people who had spent their entire lives proving they deserved the most basic right, the right to be treated with respect. In the back, customers waiting for their transactions began to murmur. Shock, annoyance, quiet, restrained anger. A middle-aged woman whispered, "She just wants to withdraw her own money." But no one dared say it aloud. No one dared to intervene. Spaces like this always carry an invisible boundary, a warning to stay silent, to avoid trouble, to avoid becoming the next target. Danielle stood there, calm as a still lake, but deep within her eyes, a small flame had been lit, a flame of pain that refused to bow, a flame born from someone who had endured enough. Inside Mark and Eli, a faint flicker of guilt stirred. They knew nothing about this woman, yet something in her posture, in her gaze, told them this was wrong, deeply wrong. But they still followed orders, the reflex of people trapped in a system broken for far too long. In Bethany's mind, satisfaction rose like smoke. She believed she was doing the right thing, protecting the bank from risk. That confidence kept her from noticing that every word, every gesture was being recorded by dozens of phones held high around the lobby. As for Danielle, the sting of past humiliations returned like old shadows. All the times ignorance and bias had stood in her way. All the moments she had needed to be twice as capable to receive half the recognition. The memories surged like a wave, but this time that wave did not drown her, it lifted her. A quiet plan awakened inside her, sharp and steady. Danielle exhaled softly. She reached into her faded fabric tote, slow, calm, deliberate. A few people gasped, expecting resistance. But no, all she pulled out was an old phone. She opened her contacts. Her finger slid toward the single name that could turn everything around. And in that moment in which a woman stared humiliation in the face and chose to rise instead of bend, the atmosphere inside the bank froze, as if the entire world was waiting for the explosion about to come, as if the fate of those wielding their authority so carelessly was about to reverse in the blink of an eye. In that suspended silence, Danielle's eyes gleamed deep and unwavering. She pressed call, one phone call, one voice, one man on the other end. And within a few minutes, nothing at Heritage Bank would ever be the same again. The morning at Heritage Bank seemed to move with its usual rhythm, the soft clatter of keyboards, the high-pitched whir of printers, the steady click of heels gliding across polished stone floors. But beneath that smooth surface were fractures only the perceptive could see. And today that perceptive person was Danielle Brooks, sitting in the back row with her faded fabric tote and eyes that could see straight through the outer layers of things. The moment she stepped into the downtown Houston branch, Danielle sensed something off. The atmosphere did not carry the structured order of a major financial institution, but rather the uneasy hum of a place where power did not lie in procedures, but in the judgment of whoever held authority. Danielle did not look at her phone like the others. She observed. She listened. She noted every detail, the shallow breaths of people being ignored, the way employees shifted their attitude, depending on clothing or skin color, the quiet discrimination slipping into every question, every glance, every movement. Thomas Reed, a white man in a silver-gray suit with a gleaming Rolex, had barely stepped through the door before receptionist Linda Parker sprang up with a smile bright enough to belong on a stage. "Welcome, Mr. Reed. Let me take you to the VIP room," Linda said, with a practiced tilt of her head, her voice sweet enough to melt into the air. From the back row, Danielle did not smile and did not frown. She simply watched. 1 minute later, an elderly Asian couple entered, backs hunched, hair-silvered steps, slow and careful. Linda glanced at them for exactly 1 second before pointing them toward the farthest corner of the lobby. "Take a number and wait for your turn," she said, her tone dry, cold, and stripped of even the most basic respect. Danielle's chest tightened slightly as she watched the couple shuffle toward the seats. She had witnessed this scene all her life, painful, small, quietly endured. Then Sophie Adams walked in, fair skin, blonde hair catching the light. Linda's face lit up immediately. "Sophie, how was your weekend picnic?" 2 minutes later, Sophie finished her transaction and left with a courtesy voucher. Danielle inhaled softly. She did not need internal reports. Reality unfolding before her was clearer than any document. When discrimination becomes as natural as breathing, it is no longer an individual flaw, but a habit nurtured by an entire system. Time dragged on. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. 2 waves of customers arrived and left. But every time Danielle looked up, Linda pretended not to see her. Danielle stood slightly ready to ask, but Linda immediately grabbed her phone and pretended to be busy. Danielle stepped back, the familiar sting settling into her chest, the sting of someone who had been treated as unworthy of service too many times before. Then a Mexican man approached Greg Mason's counter. Danielle saw the coldness in Greg's eyes as he fired questions at him. "What is your job? Why are you withdrawing this amount?" "Address documents." Greg flipped the man's ID back and forth as though examining a piece of evidence. Danielle's chest tightened, not because Greg was particularly harsh, but because his behavior was automatic, the reflex of someone who had done this too often. Employees do not invent prejudice. They simply carry it out like programming. Danielle counted each second. She thought of the reports she had received in recent months. Customers of color claim unfair treatment. Immigrant clients say they were interrogated excessively. Low-income clients report being flagged as suspicious. She had wanted to see it for herself, and now everything she suspected was unfolding without a single deviation. When the man walked away with a heavy expression, Danielle knew she could no longer stay on the sidelines, but she also knew that to fix a system, she first had to let it expose every flaw on its own. That was why her silence right now was a strategy. At last, Linda called out, "Number 47, counter 4. Danielle rose. No one realized that this moment marked the beginning of a reconstruction that would reshape the entire bank. She walked toward counter 4, where Emily Carter sat waiting her makeup, pale, and rushed hair pulled into a tidy ponytail, eyes carrying weeks of quiet exhaustion. Emily looked Danielle up and down, once then asked, with detached politeness, "What do you need?" Danielle gently placed 3 items on the counter: her bank card, her ID, and the withdrawal slip. "I want to withdraw $75,000. Emily hesitated for a moment. Not because of the amount, but because Danielle did not look like someone who would request that amount. Emily glanced at Greg, and in the split second their eyes met, Danielle understood the game was about to begin. Greg stepped over wearing a theatrically stern expression, as if he had just uncovered financial fraud. For an amount that large, Greg said loudly enough for half the lobby to hear, "I need to verify." Danielle looked at him directly. No anger, no fear. Just a silence that made him uneasy. Emily began typing slower than usual. She checked the card, checked the ID typed in the account number, then checked again, as if the entire sequence was designed to make Danielle feel scrutinized, doubted, and dismissed. An older man in line muttered, "She has been waiting since early," but his voice faded quickly in the tense air. Danielle glanced at the clock. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since she entered the bank, and then the moment she had anticipated arrived: the stares, the whispers, the phones subtly lifting, recording her, judging her. Danielle felt the loneliness settle over the room, as though every wall were pushing her into a corner. But in that same moment, something else began to rise inside her. A cold determination, a small flame ready to expose a truth that could no longer be buried. Because today, Heritage Bank was about to face itself, and none of them knew that the woman they were dismissing so casually was the one person with the power to change the fate of this bank forever. The air around counter number 4 froze, as if every sound in the room had been pulled into the tension between Danielle Brooks and the 3 employees standing before her. Emily Carter's hands trembled. Greg Mason clenched his jaw to maintain his forced sternness, and Jason Miller stood with his arms crossed against the glass partition, his expression smug as though he were watching a show. Danielle kept her gaze calm, but inside, her emotions surged like an underground current, ready to break through the surface, the sting of being underestimated, and the resolve to make sure this would never happen again. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been forced into that same position. "This is an unusual withdrawal," Greg declared, raising his voice so the whole lobby could hear, as if he wanted to turn Danielle into a public suspect. Situations like this require special verification. He emphasized the words, "situations like this," and more than a few people understood exactly what he meant. Emily typed with an agonizing slowness, each click hitting Danielle's patience like a hammer. Every check she performed was unnecessary, clearly designed to stretch the interrogation, to make Danielle feel small, isolated wrong. "Have you received any unusual income in the past few months?" Emily asked coldly, her eyes revealing the judgment she did not bother to hide. Danielle tilted her head slightly and replied gently, "I have submitted every document required. My account is valid. If anything needs review, your system will show it." Her composure unsettled Emily even more, which only made Greg's irritation rise. He stepped closer, using the weight of his broad frame as a tool to press power onto the woman before him. "Let me ask again," Greg said slower this time, each word sharp. "You need to explain the reason for this withdrawal." A few nearby customers held their breath. An elderly man frowned at the scene, not because he doubted Danielle, but because he could not understand why a personal transaction had turned into a public interrogation. A young mother in the waiting area lifted her phone to record, sensing something deeply wrong. A young man farther back eyed the glowing promotional screens behind Danielle, where Heritage Bank's slogan read, "Respect every customer." The irony only thickened the tension in the room. Danielle did not break eye contact with Greg. "I have no obligation to explain the purpose of my personal withdrawal unless there is a legal requirement. If you have doubts, check your system. Everything is there." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Jason let out a small, mocking laugh, loud enough for Danielle to hear. "She does not look like someone with $75,000. We are right to question it." The comment was soft, but it cut like a blade. Danielle did not react. Emily did. The computer mouse slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the desk. It was clear the cruelty had crossed a line even she could no longer stomach. From the reception counter, Linda Parker began glancing over with a mix of annoyance and anticipation, as if waiting for any excuse to justify throwing Danielle out. Another customer whispered, "Why are they not processing her transaction normally? She looks perfectly legitimate." A man in a black suit shook his head in quiet disappointment. Piece by piece, the injustice was being stitched together in front of more than 20 witnesses. And then the moment Danielle had foreseen finally arrived. A familiar figure with neatly tied brown hair and black heels strode quickly across the lobby, Bethany Clark, the branch manager. She approached with the expression of a commander entering the battle, her gaze heavy with authority and completely devoid of goodwill. "What is happening here?" Bethany asked, though it was not a question. It was a declaration of control. Greg responded immediately. "This customer wants to withdraw a large amount. I believe there are signs of irregularity." Emily lowered her head, unable to speak, and Jason straightened up, waiting for Bethany's command. Bethany scanned Danielle from head to toe, and in a single brief moment, her expression revealed every judgment Danielle had endured throughout her life. "That amount does not match your profile," Bethany said, her voice as sharp as metal. "And we do not serve high-risk customers. The words 'we do not serve' hit the stone floor like a dropped weight." An elderly man protested, "She just wants to withdraw her own money." But Bethany ignored him. "You are causing a disturbance," she declared firmly, "and we will not tolerate it." Danielle felt every gaze in the room land on her sympathetic eyes, angry eyes, doubtful eyes, indifferent eyes. She heard her heartbeat slow, deepen, sharpen. When humiliated, people usually choose to fight or to retreat. Danielle chose neither. She chose calm, and that calmness made Bethany feel challenged. Security, Bethany ordered without hesitation. Mark Hudson and Eli Turner stepped forward immediately. A wave of murmurs swept through the room like a cold wind. A college student near the counter gasped, "What is happening?" A woman live streaming whispered breathlessly, "They are kicking her out of the bank." "Everyone look." Danielle touched her own arm lightly as she saw Mark approach. His eyes met hers, and for a brief second, he froze. There was something in her gaze that made him hesitate. Not fear. Not pleading. Pride. Certainty. The kind of certainty innocent people often hold just before the truth comes out. Mark lowered his voice. "Ma'am, we have to." Danielle shook her head gently. "You are doing your job. I understand." Then she reached into her faded tote bag, slowly, deliberately. Bethany snapped, "What are you planning to do?" A few people jumped, thinking Danielle might resist. But when Danielle withdrew her hand, she was holding nothing more than an old phone with worn edges. She unlocked it, scrolled to a single name. One name powerful enough to change the fate of this entire branch. Those standing closest held their breath. Emily covered her mouth. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. Greg took a step back, suddenly unsure. And then Danielle pressed the call button. In that instant, the entire room plunged into a silence so thick it felt dangerous. No one knew what was about to happen, but everyone sensed it like the air before a massive storm, a shift, a reversal, a reckoning drawing near. As the first ring echoed from the phone's speaker, every heart in that room skipped a beat. And in just a few minutes, that storm would swallow everything they once believed was power. The ringtone echoed through the lobby like a blade, slicing straight through the suffocating tension. Danielle held the phone close to her chest, switched on the speaker, and her eyes remained steady and cold, so steady that several people did not even dare breathe. On the other end, Jordan Michael's calm, deep voice came through right after the second beep. "Danielle, what is happening?" The question dropped into the room like a knife that split right through the mask of authority Bethany Clark was wearing. But Bethany did not recognize it. She scoffed, crossed her arms, and said with a mocking tone, "Who do you think you are calling? If you do not leave immediately, I will call the police." Danielle did not turn around. She simply spoke slowly, each word precise, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear Jordan. "I am being denied a legal transaction. I am being treated like a criminal. Staff at this branch are detaining me and preparing to force me out of the bank." Jordan's voice sharpened instantly. Which branch? Danielle locked eyes with Bethany, unblinking. Heritage Bank, Central Houston branch. A silence, brief but deadly, hung for a single second. Then Jordan's voice dropped like thunder. "No one is to move. I am opening the security cameras. Keep the line open." The moment those words came through the speaker, a cold ripple shot through the lobby. Anyone with experience in finance knew one thing no executive ever said: opening the security cameras unless something extremely serious had occurred. Emily Carter immediately covered her mouth, her face drained of color. Greg Mason swallowed hard sweat forming at the back of his neck. Jason Miller, who had just been laughing earlier, froze, the arrogance stripped from his eyes. Only Bethany stood firm, hands on her hips, still clinging to her sense of power. She still had no idea what was slipping out of her control. "Who do you think you are calling?" Bethany said with a rising, arrogant tone. "I am the manager here. I decide how this is handled." Jordan heard every word. He did not need to raise his voice to make the guilty feel their knees weaken. "What is the name of the manager?" Danielle stared straight at Bethany Clark. A heavy sigh came through the line. No one heard it clearly, but everyone felt the omen in it. "All right," Jordan said, his voice now cold as steel. "I am contacting corporate legal, sending the signal to lock down the branch immediately. No one is to leave. The oversight team is on the way." Emily nearly collapsed into her chair. Greg looked around as if searching for an exit. Jason backed away, completely pressing himself against the glass with visible panic. Mark and Eli, the two security guards, slowly released their grip on Danielle, their eyes wide with the realization that they might have just stepped into the wrong side of something enormous. "But Bethany," she let out a dismissive laugh, "you really think you are convincing anyone? No one is important enough to have a whole branch locked down because of them." Jordan heard it all, and that was the moment his voice was no longer the voice of an operations director. It was the voice of someone holding all of their careers in the palm of his hand. "Bethany Clark," he said, each word hammered out with weight before you speak again. "You may want to think very carefully about who you are talking to." Bethany hesitated. For the first time, she stepped back half an inch as a thin line of unease crept up her spine. But her ego was far too large to allow her to show weakness in front of staff and customers. "I do not care who you are," she said, though her voice trembled. "I will not allow anyone to threaten my employees. I am the one who supervises your employees," Jordan replied, his voice dropping dangerously low. "And I am watching you violate banking regulations, professional ethics, and our anti-discrimination policies." The air in the lobby felt as though all oxygen had been sucked out. A woman live-streaming nearly dropped her phone. An elderly man whispered, "Dear God, she is finished." Danielle remained still, her eyes deep and calm, but her heart tightened with a familiar ache. Not fear. Pain. The pain of seeing hatred born from society's deepest prejudices. But within that pain was another fire. A fire waiting to be unleashed. "I want you to hear this clearly," Danielle said, her voice even but sharp as a blade. "Bethany Clark ordered me to be removed from the bank. They doubted me because of the way I look. No one checked the system before accusing me." Jordan answered immediately without hesitation. "I reviewed the cameras. Everything is recorded. The oversight team is coming." Bethany stepped back another inch, the arrogance in her eyes fading for the first time. She looked around and saw her employees pale with fear, customers whispering, several recording. The truth was no longer under her control. It was spreading like a flood. But Bethany grabbed tighter onto the illusion of power, still slipping from her hands. "I do not care who you are," she repeated, her voice smaller but shaking from the effort of appearing in control. She was not cooperating. Danielle smiled softly. Not with arrogance, not with vengeance, but with the quiet clarity of truth finally exposed. "I have cooperated from the beginning," she said. But they did not cooperate with the truth. Another notification chimed from Danielle's phone. "Jordan said I am sending a full oversight unit to the branch, and I will be there in 10 minutes. No one is to leave their station." The employees in the lobby froze, as if turned to stone. A wave of dread rippled through them like a chain reaction. Emily whispered, trembling, "Oh my God, this is really happening." Fear overtook the usual arrogance in Greg's eyes. Jason bowed his head, fists clenched. Mark and Eli swallowed hard, realizing they had nearly become part of something deeply wrong. Danielle looked at them all, not with hatred, but with the gaze of someone who had endured too much to forgive without accountability. Someone who understood that healing could not begin without dragging the darkness into the light. Jordan spoke his final words before ending the call. "Danielle, stay on the line. From here on, I will handle everything." Danielle nodded gently, and the entire room heard it. In that moment, the space seemed to shrink. Every breath, every footstep, every heartbeat echoed sharply through the air. Heritage Bank, the largest branch in Houston, now stood on the edge of a storm its own people had created. And in just a few minutes, that storm would tear apart everything they once believed was power. The call ended, but its echo still hung in the suffocating air of the bank lobby. No one spoke, as if the entire room were bracing for something about to strike a thunderclap, a judgment, a truth no one wanted to face. Danielle remained still, her eyes fixed on the transaction counter, but her mind was focused on something far more terrifying, the moment when even the smallest human actions are exposed under the unforgiving light of truth. Meanwhile, at the top floor of Heritage Bank's headquarters in Austin, the internal alert system flashed to life. Every monitor in the security control room switched to the live feed from the central Houston branch, showing Danielle standing surrounded by employees, security guards, and a manager who had just abused her authority in the most blatant way. A young security analyst gasped, "Is that CEO Brooks, oh my God, next to him?" Linda Foster, the chief legal officer, froze for several seconds, her eyes wide in disbelief. But once the shock shattered, it was replaced by a deep fury, the kind only those who safeguard the rules of an institution understand. "Turn on the audio," Linda said tightly, her voice stretched like a drawn bowstring. And when Bethany's words blasted from the speakers, "You are not in our customer segment. People like you do not withdraw that amount," everyone in the room felt as if they had been punched in the chest. Among those watching, only one man kept his composure entirely, Richard Hale, chairman of the board. He said nothing. He simply stood there with his arms crossed, eyes like cold steel locked onto the screen, as if every word, every glare, every movement of those employees was being engraved into his memory for an impending purge. "This is a severe violation," Linda said, her grip tightening around a stack of documents until the pages bent. A young attorney whispered, "If this video leaks the media, we'll destroy us." Richard turned his head slightly, and that single look was enough to silence him. "This is not about media," Richard said, his voice so deep the entire room fell silent. "This is about betraying our most fundamental principle, respect for human beings." Then Jordan walked into the conference room, his expression carved from stone. "I want a full copy of the footage, from the moment Danielle walked into that branch until now," he said. "And bring me all customer complaint records from the Houston branch for the past 2 years. A records clerk sprinted out immediately. The pace of the room accelerated. Desperate typing filled the air. Internal phones rang non-stop. Staff rushed back and forth like they were preparing for a national crisis. Yet through the chaos, Richard did not move his gaze, never leaving the screen. "Is the inspection team there yet?" he asked, without looking back. 3 minutes, Jordan replied. "I will be there right after them." Richard closed his eyes and took a long, steady breath, as though trying to keep the entire institution from unraveling. "When you arrive, keep me on the video line," he said. "I want to hear their explanations myself." While headquarters braced for the storm that was about to erupt, the Houston branch was choking under a thick, heavy stillness. Emily Carter sat frozen like a statue, her eyes red from everything unfolding in front of her. She looked at Danielle as if seeing a truth she had spent her whole life ignoring. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling so quietly it almost disappeared. But Danielle simply shook her head. "This is not between you and me," she said softly. "This is about the system." Greg Mason struggled to stand upright, but fear had spread from his neck down to his fingertips, making them tremble. He looked to Jason for help, but Jason was too busy holding himself together. The cheap bravado he had flaunted earlier had evaporated, leaving only the raw terror of a man realizing he had chosen the wrong side. Bethany still tried to appear strong, but the truth was tightening around her like a closing trap. She looked around and saw the raised phones recording her, the furious eyes of customers, the eerie silence of her own staff. And for the first time, a new expression crept onto her face. Fear. Danielle remained where she stood, showing no triumph. The pain still lingered inside her, but it had transformed into a strange calm, the calm of someone who had seen darkness all her life and finally decided to drag it into the light. The entrance chime rang. A group of 4 people in black suits walked in wearing badges that read, "Internal Oversight." The customers stirred in a wave of whispers. Someone live streaming gasped, "Oh my God, they're here!" Mark and Eli instinctively stood at attention. Emily lowered her head. Greg's breath hitched. Jason looked like he wanted to run. Bethany stepped forward, desperate to regain control. "What do you need? I am the manager here," she said. One member of the oversight team looked her straight in the eyes and replied in a voice colder than ice, "We know exactly who you are, and you will remain on site for the entire review." Bethany swallowed hard. In that moment, every excuse she could have given suddenly meant nothing. A nearby computer screen lit up. The branch's surveillance footage began streaming live. Every word Bethany had said, every disdainful look Greg had given, every arrogant pose Jason had struck, every despairing breath Emily had taken, all of it played clearly, undeniably, in front of the entire lobby. A customer whispered, "There is no escape. Everything is there." Then Danielle's phone chimed with a new notification, a video call from Jordan. Daniel Jordan said, his voice deep and resonant with authority, "I'm on my way. Just a few minutes now. Keep the line open." Danielle nodded once, and everyone around her heard it. In that moment, the entire building seemed to contract. Every breath, every shuffle, every heartbeat echoed with razor-sharp clarity. Heritage Bank, the Houston branch, was standing at the threshold of a moment that would rewrite its history. And as that door prepared to open, everyone in the room understood one thing no one would be able to hide in the shadows anymore. The glass doors of the Heritage Bank branch swung open again, and this time it was not a customer entering, but a presence that made the entire room drop a few degrees. Jordan Michaels walked in. His charcoal suit framed his tall build, his eyes sharp like a blade, fresh from the forge, and each step he took sounded like the countdown to a verdict. The internal oversight officers followed behind him, and in front of them the lobby held its breath silent enough that the trembling breaths of those who knew they were guilty could be heard. Danielle stood at the center, her gaze meeting Jordan's for a single second, and in that moment everyone realized this was no longer a routine incident. It was an unveiling, a line drawn between light and shadow. Jordan did not glance around. He looked only toward the counter where Bethany Clark stood, pale and stiff, like someone who had just felt the blood drain out of her body. Minutes earlier she had stood with arms crossed, barking orders, throwing insults at Danielle, completely unaware that every word she flung would become evidence against her. "Who is Bethany Clark?" Jordan asked. His voice was low but carried through the room with force. He did not need to shout yet. He made every spine straighten. Bethany tried to square her shoulders, but her lips trembled as she answered, I am the manager here. Jordan stopped a few steps from her. He did not have to move closer for his authority to overshadow the entire transaction area. Good, he said. Then you will be the first to explain why a legitimate customer was denied service, threatened, and ordered out of the bank. Bethany swallowed her throat dry as sand, but her instinct to cling to control made her attempt. This woman was behaving suspiciously. I was only trying to protect the bank from risk. Jordan tilted his head, and his eyes turned colder. Risk. He tapped a button on his smartwatch. The large screen near the counter lit up, replaying the surveillance footage in fast sequence. Every discriminatory comment, every contemptuous look, every judgmental stare each moment was shown in such clarity that even those who were not involved felt exposed. The moment Bethany pointed and said, "You are not in our customer segment." The moment Greg exchanged a cruel glance with Jason. The moment Emily lowered her eyes, worried but silent. The moment Mark put his hand on Danielle's arm. The moment Eli blocked the door. No denials, no excuses, no reversals. When the video stopped, the room felt hollow. Bethany opened her mouth, but Jordan lifted one finger to silence her. He did not need to raise his voice. His presence alone made her freeze. "You say you were protecting the bank from risk," Jordan asked. "The greatest risk to this bank," he said, pointing directly at her, "is people who use their authority to discriminate against innocent customers." A customer at the back exclaimed, "That is right," others nodded. A wave of murmurs spread like rippling water. Live streams buzzed with exploding comments. Bethany's face drained of color, but the fear spread beyond her. Greg Mason could barely stay upright, his hands clenched until his knuckles turned white. Jason Miller stared at the floor, shoulders tight, wishing he could vanish. Emily's tears finally spilled, not from fear of punishment, but from the realization that her silence had contributed to the injustice. Jordan turned to Danielle, and though his voice softened slightly, it still carried enough power to shake every guilty conscience in the room. "Do you have any request before we issue disciplinary actions?" Danielle stepped forward slowly. Her eyes did not aim at authority, but at every person who had treated her unfairly. "I am not here for revenge," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "I am here for the truth. What happened this morning was not just aimed at me. It has happened to many others, and if I do not stand up today, it will never stop." A wave of emotion swept through the onlookers. An older woman wiped a tear. A young man raised his thumb. A middle-aged customer whispered, "Absolutely right." Jordan nodded. "I understand." But before he could say more, a voice boomed from the entrance, deep, firm, and powerful enough to make everyone turn at once. It was Richard Hale, the chairman of Heritage Bank, stepped into the branch with a calmness that carried far more weight than any outburst. Anyone who had ever seen Richard in boardrooms knew one thing: if he appeared on site, the matter had escalated far beyond managerial level and had reached the highest tier of the institution. Richard stopped directly in front of Bethany, looking at her as though she were made of transparent glass. I have seen everything he said, each word heavy as stone. There is nothing left to explain. Bethany opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Richard looked at Greg, then Jason, then Emily, then at the two guards. Each one shrank as if a spotlight had been turned on the darkest corners of their conscience. "You have forgotten that this bank exists because of people," Richard said. "Not because of how they look. Not because of your assumptions. Not because of the chairs you sit in." Greg lowered his head. Jason stopped breathing. Emily cried openly. And you also forgot, Richard continued, that the person standing before you could be someone you would never expect. Customers gasped slightly. His words were not just a reminder, they were a sentence. Richard turned to Danielle. He placed a hand over his chest and bowed his head slightly. A gesture of the highest respect. On behalf of Heritage Bank, he said, "I apologize." Danielle did not respond immediately. In her eyes was a familiar pain, not just from today, but from years of being dismissed. But alongside it was something else, strength. Richard faced his staff again. "Begin disciplinary procedures," he ordered. Immediately. And in that moment, true power returned to where it belonged, the side of justice. Heritage Bank Houston branch was not just witnessing a disciplinary action, it was witnessing an awakening, and this journey had only just begun. When Richard Hale issued the disciplinary order, the entire bank lobby seemed to plunge into a silent earthquake, a force so intense that everyone felt the shock reverberate inside their chest. The internal oversight officers immediately dispersed, each carrying a tablet, a notebook and folders, as they began the first steps of their investigation. But what stunned everyone most was not their speed. It was their expressions, cold, precise, unmoved. They were not looking at staff as colleagues. They were looking at them the way truth looks at wrongdoing, the way justice looks at evidence. Bethany Clark stood frozen, her lips pale, as though every drop of blood had left her body. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, as if even her own voice refused to betray the truth any further. Greg Mason stared down at his shaking hands, eyes stretched wide in fear, while Jason Miller leaned against the glass wall legs, so weak they could barely support him. The smug arrogance he had flaunted earlier was gone. In its place was only a man facing the consequences of a pride he never expected would be exposed so quickly. Emily Carter wiped her tears, but the more she wiped, the more they came. In her eyes, there was not only shame for herself, but horror at the realization that the things she overlooked today might have hurt countless customers before. Jordan stood beside Richard, with his arms crossed his gaze, carrying neither hatred nor fury. It was the look of someone who had seen too many people perish under the illusion that their small slice of power was absolute. As the oversight team began taking statements, each staff member was forced to answer questions, and every question pierced directly into the gray areas they had once used to justify themselves. Why did you judge a customer before checking her information? Are you aware that non-discrimination policy is mandatory for every transaction? Who gave the order to force the customer out of the lobby? No one could answer smoothly. Every response was interrupted by fear, by guilt, by the presence of the woman standing in the center of the room, the woman they had never respected, never valued, never even considered treating fairly. Danielle. While everyone else faced interrogation, Danielle stood still, calm as still water. Yet in that calm was a power so unmistakable that no one dared look at her lightly anymore. She was not the victim. She was the center of truth. One of the oversight officers approached her, speaking with genuine respect. "Ma'am, we need to confirm a few points from the video and the statements. If you could?" Danielle nodded. "I am ready." Everyone heard that steady voice, and it only made those at fault bow their heads lower. As the oversight team continued their work, Richard and Jordan stepped forward to speak with Danielle. Richard said quietly, "Miss Brooks, I cannot fully express the shame this branch has brought upon you. Danielle looked directly at him, her voice soft, yet sharp. Not just upon me. There are people who walked in here every day. People who were not filmed, who had no one stand up for them, whose cases were never investigated. Richard fell silent. But his silence was not avoidance. It was acknowledgement. Jordan added, "You are right. And today is the day that changes." As his words settled into the air on the far side of the room, Mark Hudson, the security guard who had grabbed Danielle's arm, suddenly stepped forward. His voice was deep but trembling. "I am sorry," he said, looking Danielle straight in the eye without flinching. "When I put my hand on you, I knew it was wrong. But I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid of disobeying orders." Danielle looked at him for a long moment. "I understand," she said. "But fear cannot be an excuse to harm another person." Mark lowered his head, and for the first time that morning, someone cried, not from fear of punishment, but from facing the truth about himself. Behind him, Eli Turner slowly raised his hand as well. "I am sorry too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I did not stand up when I should have." Customers began to applaud softly, not to celebrate wrongdoing, but to acknowledge the courage it took to face it. And that truth shifted the atmosphere in the strangest way. The suffocating tension eased into something lighter, like fresh air flowing through a newly opened window. But not everyone shared that moment. When oversight officers questioned Bethany again, she clung stubbornly to her pride. "I only did what I believed was best for the bank." An officer replied immediately, "By violating core bank policy, by discriminating against a customer, by threatening someone who attempted a legal withdrawal." Each question struck her like a mirror, reflecting her own actions back at her. And for the first time, Bethany found herself trapped in a corner from which authority could not save her. She could no longer speak. She could only stare at the polished floor where her own reflection looked back at her small, distorted, and deeply wrong. The entrance bell chimed again. A new group entered the Internal Ethics Council and the regional director. The moment they saw Danielle standing in the center of the room, they understood this was not an incident. This was a reckoning. A test this branch had failed catastrophically. Richard turned to face everyone, and the words he spoke silenced the entire room. "Today we are not witnessing the downfall of a few individuals. We are witnessing the collapse of a broken culture. But from this point forward," he looked at Danielle, "we rebuild." Danielle exhaled a quiet breath, carrying the weight of years of enduring in silence. A customer called out loudly, "Thank you for standing up for all of us," and voices rose from every corner. "That is right. We support you. No one deserves to be treated like that." Phones kept recording, broadcasting the moment to thousands, then millions. And at the center of every frame, Danielle Brooks stood not as a victim, but as the symbol of an awakening this bank had never seen before. The storm had torn through, but now the light was beginning to break through, clearing the path for what would come next. And everyone could feel it. What came next would not be collapse. It would be rebirth. When the final words of Richard Hale were still hanging in the air, the entire lobby fell into a strange stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too deeply. The oversight officers scribbled notes with swift precision, customers clustered together in hushed groups, and the employees kept their heads bowed. Everyone felt the same heavy instinct, the sense that the next moment would be decisive, like the distant drum beats before soldiers march into battle. Danielle looked around the room. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of someone enduring injustice, but of someone surveying a land she was about to rebuild from its foundation. The faces in the waiting chairs, the confused eyes, the trembling smiles, the people live streaming, the people swallowing tears, all of them formed a picture that was both painful and beautiful. Painful because the truth had just been stripped bare. Beautiful because everyone now understood. Change was overdue. Jordan stood beside Richard, his eyes deep and still like a lake, disturbed by a night wind. He looked at Danielle with a level of respect that words could not fully express. Deep inside, he knew that what happened today would shake the entire banking system, not in a destructive way, but in a way that would make it more just, more ethical, more humane. When an oversight officer stepped forward and whispered, "We have completed the initial statements, preparing to move into suspension procedures as ordered," Richard nodded his eyes, settling firmly on the group of employees responsible for the misconduct. "Bring them forward," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it echoed across the entire lobby. With slow, heavy steps, Bethany Clark approached, like someone walking through a dream. Houston winters were not cold enough to make someone shiver, yet her shoulders shook as though pierced by a freezing wind. Greg followed her, his face as pale as unwritten paper. Jason walked behind them, stripped of his earlier arrogance, avoiding every phone camera pointed his way. Emily came last, tears streaming freely, her steps unsteady, like someone waking from a nightmare she herself helped create. When they stood in a line before Richard, the air tightened, as if the entire room were waiting for a verdict. Richard adjusted the button on his suit jacket, a small gesture that nonetheless radiated authority. "I have reviewed everything from beginning to end," he said, his voice lowering, "and I do not require any further justification." Bethany opened her mouth, a choked sound escaping, but Richard raised a hand, stopping her instantly. "No," he said. "It is far too late for explanations." Danielle did not look away. This was not a moment of satisfaction for her. It was a moment of witnessing a system hold itself accountable, something she had never imagined she would live to see. Richard turned to the oversight team. "Record this in the official report." Then he faced Bethany directly. "Bethany Clark, you are terminated effective immediately for discriminatory behavior, abuse of authority in financial transactions, violation of professional ethics, and severe damage to the bank's reputation." The room erupted in a collective gasp, a sound that felt like a suppressed explosion. No one cheered. But everyone knew the decision was deserved. Bethany stood frozen, her eyes unfocused. She did not cry, but her hands trembled violently, as though the only thing she had ever believed she possessed her power had been torn away. Richard continued, his tone no warmer than the verdict itself. "Greg Mason, you are terminated for discriminatory conduct, improper transaction handling, and applying unlawful pressure on a customer." Greg shook so hard his knees nearly buckled. Cold sweat trickled down his spine, soaking into the collar of his shirt, a physical reminder of the weight of his mistakes. "Jason Miller," Richard said, turning his gaze, "you are terminated for verbally insulting a customer, displaying severe disrespect, and contributing to a hostile service environment." Jason did not lift his head. Shame filled the air around him, like a dark cloud. "Emily Carter." Richard said, his voice softening slightly. "You are suspended pending further investigation. Your silence worsened the situation. But your remorse is noted." Emily burst into heavier sobs, covering her face with both hands. Danielle looked at her not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. Sometimes, a single spoken word can prevent a person from being crushed, Richard then turned to the two security guards. "Mark Hudson, Eli Turner, you are temporarily suspended until you complete retraining and undergo a full reassessment." Both men nodded without protest. They did not defend themselves, because deep down they knew the truth: they were wrong. When the list of disciplinary actions was completed, the lobby fell into another silence, not heavy like before, but calm, like a lake settling after a violent storm. From the waiting area, an elderly woman stepped forward, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she said to Danielle, her voice trembling. "If you had not stood up," her voice broke. Danielle gently touched her hand and offered a warm smile, like giving her a piece of light she had lived without for many years. A young man lifted his phone and announced on his live stream, "Everyone, this is the real CEO of Heritage Bank." She was treated worse than a homeless person, and now justice has finally arrived. Whispers spread through the room like ripples. Customers' eyes shifted from shock to deep respect. A few people clapped softly, then more, until the entire bank was filled with applause, quiet but full of emotion. Danielle did not back away. She did not bow her head. She did not revel in triumph. She simply stood there and allowed the sound to reach her heart. An oversight officer approached, bowed slightly, and said, "We will handle everything from here. You may leave whenever you wish." But Danielle looked around the room and knew she was not leaving. Not yet. There was one last thing she needed to say. One final truth that would become the guiding flame for the rebirth this bank desperately needed. And as she stepped forward, every pair of eyes turned toward her once more, like turning toward dawn, breaking after a long, suffocating night. Danielle stood before the entire bank lobby, where everyone who had just lived through a storm of truth now waited in complete silence, as if they all understood that this moment after the disciplinary verdict, was not an ending, but the threshold of something far greater. The eyes fixed on her were not merely watching, they carried hope, expectation, and a quiet question: after everything that had happened, could a new trust truly be rebuilt? Danielle looked at each person, each face, and she saw overlapping emotions, shame on the faces of those who had been at fault relief, in those who had stayed silent, remorse in those who had been complicit, and the simmering anger of customers who had witnessed far too much injustice in their lives. She took a long breath, letting her heart fill with memories of the countless times she had been misjudged, the doors she had been pushed away from, even though she had every right to walk through them. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but clear and steady, resonating through the lobby like a bell dissolving the last remnants of fog. "I want everyone to hear this," Danielle said, her tone calm as still water, but carrying the hidden force of an undercurrent. "I did not come here to show power. I did not disguise myself to test anyone. I came here because I needed to know the truth about how we treat people who do not look the way we expect." A few customers nodded softly, their eyes softening as her words touched wounds they had kept hidden for years. Danielle continued, "And today I did not only witness wrongdoing, I saw fear. Fear of losing a job, fear of losing a position, fear of going against the majority. But the most dangerous fear," she paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, "is the fear of doing what is right." The bank fell silent. Absolutely silent. No clapping, no whispering, only pure, unwavering attention. "But I also saw something else," Danielle said, her voice warming. "I saw courage. I saw sincere remorse. I saw people who want to change. And that is why I am still standing here. Not to overthrow anyone, but to rebuild this place with all of you. A place that is safe for everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what they wear, no matter how much money they have in their account. Emily Carter covered her mouth with a trembling hand as tears continued to fall. A young customer who had been live streaming slowly lowered his phone as if wanting to listen with his heart rather than record the moment. An elderly man placed a hand on his wife's shoulder as she cried quietly. Danielle looked at them again, her eyes steady with a resolve that nothing could shake. Today I was underestimated. But I'm not angry, she said. I am hurt. Not because of what happened to me, but because I know this has happened to many others. People with no title, no authority, no one to stand up for them. The word struck something deep inside the room. Eyes tightened. Hearts shifted. People who once believed themselves innocent felt a piece of their assumptions crack. Danielle stepped toward the transaction counter, the very place where minutes earlier she had been dismissed like a shadow. From this day on, she said, Heritage Bank will change. We will build an environment where every customer is treated with dignity, not because they have power, not because they have status, but because they are human. Several people in the lobby inhaled sharply, a long breath, carrying the sense of trust coming back to life. And I promise, Danielle said, placing her hand gently on the glass counter, we will never let injustice happen in silence again. A single clap sounded from the corner of the room, then another, until the entire bank filled with applause, a rainstorm of sound not born of triumph but of release, of belief, of hope. Danielle remained still, allowing the applause to wash over her, letting its warmth settle into her like sunlight returning after a long storm. And when the sound finally softened, she spoke one final sentence, one that many would later repeat as the beginning of a new chapter in the bank's history. Remember, this justice only has power when we are brave enough to stand for it. In that moment, the entire lobby seemed brighter, wider, as though even the Houston sky had bent low to witness an awakening no one expected would begin with a woman in a simple t-shirt and a faded canvas bag. After Danielle's declaration, the atmosphere inside the bank lobby felt cleansed, lighter, brighter, strangely pure, as if the glass ceiling had opened and let the midday sunlight pour in to wash away every trace of injustice still clinging to the air. As the applause faded, customers began approaching Danielle not with curiosity, but with genuine respect. A young woman with a backpack stepped forward, her eyes shimmering, as if she had just witnessed something capable of changing the way she saw the world. You did what we have been too afraid to do for years. Danielle gently placed a hand on her shoulder, her smile warm, yet resolute. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up, and then everyone else finds their own courage. An elderly man with silver hair approached next, his voice trembling. I was denied an account here years ago because my English was not good enough. Today, watching you, I feel like I have finally been vindicated. Danielle lowered her head respectfully. She was not a hero standing on a pedestal. She was simply giving back what she once longed for fairness. Meanwhile, the oversight team escorted the disciplined employees out of the transaction area. No one yelled, no one resisted. They walked like shadows of their own mistakes, forced to confront who they had allowed themselves to become. The glass door closed softly behind them, as if sealing away a dark chapter that the branch had finally torn from its book. Richard Hale stepped forward and stood beside Danielle, now more of an ally, or rather a man who had learned the lesson life intended to teach him through her. From this day, Richard said, turning to address the remaining staff, Heritage Bank will restructure all training, all interaction standards, and all anti-discrimination oversight systems, not because this incident was recorded, but because we should have protected our customers long ago. The employees bowed their heads, not from fear, but from shame, and from that shame, for the first time, a spark of genuine resolve began to ignite. Jordan looked at Danielle and spoke quietly enough for only her to hear, "We will do better. And with you in your position, I believe this is only the beginning." Danielle smiled, a gentle smile, but carrying the strength of someone who had fought through years of prejudice to stand where she rightfully belonged. As order gradually returned to the branch, a young employee approached her, nervously clutching a tablet. "Ma'am, would you like an escort to the exit? There are many people gathered outside because the video is spreading online." Danielle lifted her gaze and looked through the clear bank windows, where dozens of people were gathered, phones raised, waiting. She shook her head. "No, I will walk out like any other customer." The doors opened, and daylight rushed in, casting itself across Danielle's face as if the entire sky were welcoming the return of something simple yet profoundly valuable justice. As she stepped outside, the crowd erupted. "Danielle, Danielle! Thank you, you changed the whole system." Phones lifted like torches of a new era. Someone shouted, "You made us believe justice still exists." Danielle only smiled as she walked down the steps. "I did not change the system," she said firmly. "We changed it together." The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, then exploded into applause, louder than anything inside the bank. Behind the glass doors, Jordan and Richard watched her leave. Jordan murmured, "That is why she is the CEO." Richard nodded. Not because of the title, because of her heart. As Danielle left the branch, a gentle breeze swept through, carrying the feeling that the world had just turned to a new page. A page no longer written by blind judgment or abused authority, but by the courage of an ordinary woman who dared to face injustice head-on. And as everyone watched her go, none of them knew that this moment would not simply end here. It would be shared, retold, remembered as a symbol of resilience. Because justice once lit does not only guide the righteous, it guides the entire world. From the perspective of an organizational behavior expert, the incident at Heritage Bank is not just a shock to professional ethics. It is a sharp reminder of an old and undeniable truth. Any system, no matter how large, can rot from within when the people inside it forget the fundamental value of respect. Yet it is moments like today when one individual dares to stand up, dares to confront, dares to expose what has long been hidden, that become the most powerful catalysts for transforming an entire structure. Danielle did not just defend her own dignity. She defended the dignity of everyone who has ever been dismissed because of their appearance, their background, or their status. If this story moved you, please, like the video to help spread the message of fairness and courage, and subscribe to continue following journeys where truth always carries weight. Finally, leave a comment with the phrase, "Stand up," to remind one another that change only begins when someone dares not to bow to injustice.